Morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to give this presentation to you. This came about quite accidentally. I stumbled onto this topic through a series of experiences, and I didn't expect to have these findings. So I'm really delighted to be amongst friends here and share something that's very close to my heart. So this talk will have three chunks. First, I'm going to share how I got into this. Then I'm going to talk about the neuroscience aspect of it. And then I'll also discuss implications on how I have practiced decision analysis as a result of these findings. So I'll start at the beginning. The conversation that really got me into decision analysis was the first day of class when Ron Howard said, "You can't judge a decision from the outcome." And that really shook my world, because coming from India, I'd grown up in a culture where the Indian philosophers say this in the Bhagavad Gita. The whole basis of the Gita is one sentence which says, "You're not competent to judge the results of your actions, therefore focus on right action." And my God, Professor Howard is giving us the same principle. So I went after class and I told him, "Professor Howard, this is in the Gita." And he says, "Yeah, but they haven't told you how to apply this in finance, and here we've worked out the details." And that just completely blew my mind. And this was big for me because I grew up hearing this principle that focus on right action, making good decisions. But then you enter the professional world, and guess what? You are rewarded not for making great decisions, but for getting great outcomes. So there's this massive disconnect. And I wasn't able to make sense of this disconnect until I got into decision analysis. And for the first time, I saw that there was a way in which you could bring this tremendously awesome teaching to life. No matter what background you come from, this is something that just unites all of us. This is some of the highest ideals of humankind that has come to life because of our profession. So I just feel deeply honored to be in this profession and to have received this and to share this with all of you. So I got into this, and very quickly, the question for me was, what is value? And I spent my whole research dissertation was on this topic of value. And by value, the way people hear the term value is cultural norms. That's the usually accepted usage of that word. I don't mean it in that way. So that's not what I'll be talking about. So integrity is really important as a value. That's not what I mean by value. The other way in which people hear the word value is objective functions for trade-offs, value measures, and value functions. The only group of people that hears of value in that way are the people sitting in this room. And that's also not how I mean when I use the word value. I mean it in a completely different way, a third kind of listening, and I mean it as what's important to you. So for the rest of this talk, when I use the word value, that's what I'm talking about. So when I reflected on what is of value to me in decision analysis, what have I received from it, three things come, and this is, again, something that Ron talks about: truth, clarity, and freedom. And truth is such an amazing thing. Carl talked a little about it, that our starting point is truth, the whole truth of our present moment. And decision analysis really starts there. What is your truth? And it's the mathematics of truth. And right now, my truth is I'm just really grateful that you're giving me your undivided attention. Clarity is, well, what are you going to do with this truth? So clarity of action is, I want to be clear. I don't want to waste your time. So I have a responsibility to use clear distinctions. So that's an example of clarity. And freedom. Freedom is a huge thing. Freedom, so we are all conditioned by our experiences, by our past. But how do you stop being a prisoner of your past? How do you stop being a prisoner of your past conditioning? And decision analysis has a lot to say on this, because we explicitly look at biases, we explicitly look at how we've been conditioned, so that the future is not a linear extension of the past, so that we can choose the conditioning we want instead of just mindlessly going forward the way we've always been. And so in that sense, freedom is a very important value that's embedded in decision analysis. So these three things stand out, and you'll see this as a thread in what I have to say going forward. So I'm going to focus on truth and clarity and how they connect. And this is one of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore, who got the Nobel laureate, who was a Nobel laureate in literature in 1913, and he says, "The small truth has words that are clear. The great truth has great silence." And my talk really is a double click on the great silence. And these are not poetic words. This literally is my research methodology, which I stumbled into quite by accident. And you'll hear more about this in just a bit. So I started off by studying the Stanford Police Department, looking at how they make decisions, and I did some ethnographic field work with them. And what I discovered was they did not see themselves as law enforcers, but they saw themselves from a lens of values. And the two core intrinsic values that they had were public safety and education, which was quite remarkable. I didn't expect that kind of an orientation going in. So when I discovered this, the question was, well, what do we do with this? So now they have decisions. How do I connect metrics to these things? And one thing led to another, because this has nothing to do with making money. So I asked Professor Howard, I actually realized one thing. We're optimizing value, but I actually don't know what the word value means. And so Professor Howard said, well, let me talk about this man, Robert Hartman. Robert Hartman was a professor who in the 50s, when Professor Howard was an undergraduate student at MIT, he passed through MIT for just one summer, and Professor Howard took that class. And so he remembered what Hartman said about value. And Hartman was the creator of a field called formal axiology. Axiology is the study of the nature of value, which I had no idea about. And that just completely changed the direction of my research. So, and the story about Hartman is remarkable. This was a man who came out of Nazi Germany, and he was very, very sensitive to devaluation of life with numbers, which was happening way before Nazi Germany even happened. This was happening in post-First World War Germany. And he fled Nazi Germany, and he dedicated his whole life to building the mathematics of value. And his goal was to create a mathematics where no one would devalue life again. And this is impossible. This is like some people would call it a fool's quest. But surprisingly, he succeeded. And it was just remarkable. I'm not going to talk about how he succeeded, and I've written extensively about it. If you have any interest, I will be happy to share some of that. But I will focus on one core distinction that Hartman brought out, and that is how we experience this idea of intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is that which is an end in itself. It's not a means to an end. It's so deep in our feeling. And he pointed out that the way we experience intrinsic value is as inseparability from ourselves. So we cannot separate who we are from this value. So when this distinction came up, this caused me to listen in a very different way. So how do you listen for inseparability? So when we are doing our usual value conversations, I'm really engaging my head. What is important? Fundamental objective, means objective, direct value, indirect value, how much are the trade-offs? But this is a different kind of listening. I'm listening for inseparability. So I went back to my dissertation, and this is something I wrote in 2010 of what I was finding. As an observer, the researcher, which is myself, notes that when the subject discovered, and this is a subject I just mapped, discovered the intrinsic value, he immediately went silent for some seconds. When he spoke next, the researcher got the impression that he felt he was finally being understood. This assenting silence has been experienced by the researcher with other subjects as well, and might be a clue that we are touching on ground that is indeed of an intrinsic nature to the subject. And there's the deep silence, the great silence. And then some strange things started happening. I started noticing that when I'm doing these conversations, I would feel physical sensations in my body. Like these were unmistakable sensations. Something weird is happening and it's not in my head. And I didn't know what to make of it. And then these conversations, especially when we're having these really inspiring moments, these subjects found it very, very meaningful. And if I asked them, they would also report something's happening in our bodies as well. And again, I didn't know what to make of this. So then I graduated, and with a freshly minted PhD on values, I assumed completely incorrectly that values would only be important to nonprofits. So I worked with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for 9 months as a consultant and built a massive portfolio management system on how do you invest to protect the Amazon rainforests. And at the end of that 9 months of work, I asked them, well, what do you think is the value here? And they said, you started this whole value mapping business. All this simulation models, portfolio management, it's fine. But that was really, really valuable to us. And I didn't know whether to feel bummed or elated. It was like 9 months, all my math skills that I was trying to show off, it didn't make a dent. But that one thing, the value mapping conversation really landed. And so that was really cool. It's nice to see my PhD work had some relevance. So, and this has happened again and again, that this piece really resonates. And then I joined SmartOrg. And with David Matheson, who's sitting there, I've had some of the most wonderful experiences of my life exploring this subject further. And he and I were working on this project together with Surely Packaging. And we applied this kind of deep listening because we got completely stuck in strategy building. And David has decades of experience doing this stuff. So we had this opening, we did the value mapping conversation. Long story short, we came up with 4 values. They came up with these 4 values, that their packaging made food safe for consumption. It kept things natural. It kept things economic because you can transport it over long distances, and it was more sustainable for the planet because you could protect food. You didn't need to grow as much food. And 4 things had nothing to do with money. The money was needed in order to deliver on this, and their packaging made it possible. Overnight, their culture changed. Lots of wonderful things happened. I won't go into details of that story. But basically, long story short, the company faced many, many traumatic events. Like their people left, a lot of churn. But the one thing that survived were these 4 values. And this is on their public website, by the way, so I don't have to share any private details. This is just for everybody to see. So that's another crazy story. And then, so David basically concluded from this crazy experience that I don't know what to make of this. Maybe only Somik can do this kind of listening, which is, again, a bummer for me. I didn't believe that. And some time went by, and David works with really top-level, the executive management of companies on strategy, and he found an opening at another company where they were stuck with strategy. So he listened in this deep way, and he found that it worked for him as well. And that was really awesome. And so the way he described it was listening for strategy. He called it strategy generating values. So he found that when you listen in this deep way, this becomes the foundation for your strategy. This is about who you want to be. And when you're clear on that, then strategy can help you. But if you don't know who you want to be, no strategy consultant can help you because anything is going to work. You just don't know. You don't have a compass. So now he says this is a part of his standard consulting toolkit. And he has lots of wonderful stories. I really invite you to talk to him. Just, he's taken this work to another level. So all of this led me to ask a simple question. Why are the mapper and the mappy so inspired by these conversations? What's really happening? And is this connection real that I'm feeling when I'm talking to someone in this, and listening in this deep way? What's happening to me physically? And I believe that the mappy is also feeling it in their bodies. Can that be validated with science? Or is it all just one big mental game I am playing to believe what I want to believe because I'm a real sucker for values? So these are just some very basic questions. And around this time, all this neuroscience, MRI machines were coming out. I mean, all these studies mapping the brain. So what would I give to be able to get into one of those machines and have the subject and myself and look at what's happening in our brains? So these were some questions I was sitting with and really grumpy about the fact that I didn't know how to even begin. So in 2017, I started looking into neuroscience. But before I tell you that story, I want to acknowledge that we are really good at understanding human biases. So 4 decades of behavioral economics have taught us that we really suck at decision making. And Danny Kahneman's book is a bestseller, and his paper, Heuristics and Biases, which is required reading in Professor Howard's class, so close to 44,000 citations. And if you look at Wikipedia, that has exploded now. We have 217 decision-making biases, 53 social biases, 54 memory biases. Every day, someone's coming up with a new bias. So that's great. That's really awesome. That's about understanding our conditioning. And the implicit bottom line in our community, if I were to state it this way, is A good decision is one where you feel balanced and achieve equanimity. Decision analysis, time and time again, we hear that it gives you peace, that you've done the best and you can move forward. The real value of decision analysis is that it helps you cross the stormy seas and get to this equanimity. But then there's this underlying current. Even though we feel emotions are important, if you really poke a little bit under the hood, I will claim that our community believes, don't trust your emotions when making decisions. They will misguide you. And that's a very reasonable thing to believe, because people have done ridiculous things when they get upset, and then things that they would not have done if they had a cool head. So that's great. This story is fantastic, but it's an incomplete picture because it's missing 4 decades of neuroscience research. So this is the other part, just as important as Kahneman and Tversky. But first, let's go to 1848, to the beginning of the story in Cavendish, Vermont. And how do you explode a rock if you're in 1848? So that's what they were doing, building rail lines. This was about pretty much where it happened. So a group of people were doing this. You drill a hole, fill it with gunpowder, then put a fuse in, put some sand, tamp the sand, and light the fuse. And the foreman that day, his name was Phineas Gage. He was a very skillful guy, good leader of men, and he did his thing. And just when he had put in the gunpowder and the fuse and was about to instruct his assistant to put in the sand, something happened that distracted the group. And he didn't realize that the assistant didn't put the sand in. So then he just took the iron rod and tamped it in. Now, iron rod hitting rock creates sparks, and spark in gunpowder is not a happy ending. So there was a big explosion, and the ferocity of the explosion caused that iron rod to shoot out, and it basically went through. So it went through his face and came out through his prefrontal cortex. And the remarkable thing about this accident was he was conscious the entire time. He literally could be taken to the doctor. He was sitting there. He was answering questions. He became blind in one eye. But other than that, he completely physically recovered. In fact, for a long time, most everybody, this is a quote from the book Descartes' Error, most everybody, John Harlow, Gage's doctor, believed the portion of the brain traversed was, for several reasons, the best fitted of any part of the cerebral substance to sustain the injury. Nothing could be further from the truth. So initially they thought this guy is just fine, this part is optional. And this comes from this work by Antonio Damasio, who's made seminal contributions in this field. So I will be quoting largely from his body of work, him and his colleagues. He is in University of Southern California, and he runs a lab with his wife, who's also a very famous neuroscientist, Hannah Damasio. So getting back to this, nothing could be further from the truth. So what was the truth? The changes that happened to him was that his personality completely altered. And in a pretty tragic way, he basically had a hard time making decisions that were good for him. His socioeconomic decisions, the way he related to people, completely broke down. So before, he was a polite guy looking out for the people who worked for him. After this accident happened, he became very foul-mouthed. He couldn't stop swearing. He would be very aggressive. And so women were warned not to be near him lest they be befouled by his language. That was how they put it in those days. So, and he didn't have a long life. 10 years later, he basically joined a circus showing, because he couldn't hold a job, so he was showing his injury and the rod. 10 years later, he passed away, and it was a very tragic life. Now, coming to the present time, Damasio talks about a modern Phineas Gage. He has the pseudonym Elliot. And this gentleman had a meningioma, which was pushing against his brain tissue. So the tumor was removed surgically, but his frontal lobe was damaged. His cognitive abilities, just like Phineas Gage, was completely intact, but he had a total change of personality. He became terrible in executive function and could not hold jobs. He made decisions that bankrupted him and caused 2 divorces. Finally, Social Security stopped paying him, saying that, look, he looks just fine. I mean, why, we don't understand how he's disabled. That's when Damasio started working with him. And so they did a battery of tests, and they found that his attention and working memory were just fine. His short-term and long-term memory were just fine. Cognitive ability, no problem. Arithmetic, no problem. New language ability, no problem. Alternative generation ability, no problem. He was very creative. He passed special tests for frontal lobe dysfunction as well. But he was unable to decide properly, especially on personal and social matters. He had no more strong emotions. He said that before I used to feel strongly about certain things, I don't feel that way anymore. He could reason through problems, he could just not make a decision. And Damasio says, at the end of one session, after he had produced an abundant quantity of options for action, all of which were valid and implementable, Eliot smiled, apparently satisfied with his rich imagination, but added, and after all this, I still wouldn't know what to do. And this tragic situation is, Damasio says, it's to know but not to feel. And he uses the word know in the sense of intellectually know, there are all these options, pros and cons, but I don't know which one I would pick. Can you imagine what a tragic life that is? So what neurobiology tells us about emotion and reason, the first one is not controversial, and it is that seemingly normal reason can be disturbed by subtle biases rooted in emotion. And we know that very well with Kahneman and Tversky's work. But the second part is really interesting. Reduction in emotion may constitute an equally important source of irrational behavior. And that's something that I hadn't considered before coming across this work. So, and Damasio says we need to revise our old school understanding of the human brain. So what's the old school view? The old school view is that the old brain core handles basic biological regulation of emotions down in the basement, while up above the neocortex deliberates with wisdom and subtlety. Upstairs in the cortex, there is reason and willpower, while downstairs in the subcortex, there is emotion and all that weak, fleshy stuff. So, the new view is that the apparatus of rationality, traditionally presumed to be neocortical, does not seem to work without that of biological regulation of emotions, traditionally presumed to be subcortical. Nature appears to have built the apparatus of rationality not just on top of the apparatus of biological regulation, but also from it and with it. And that's really, really interesting. It's a different view of the human brain. Now, what happens when you really can't feel? So this has been well studied from sociopaths, and Damasio notes that developmental sociopaths are well known to all of us from the daily news. The threshold at which their emotions kick in, when they do, is so high that they appear unflappable and are, from their self-reports, unfeeling and uncaring. They are the very picture of the cool head we were told to keep in order to do the right thing. In cold blood, and to everybody's obvious disadvantage, including their own, sociopaths often repeat their crimes. They are, in fact, yet another example of a pathological state in which a decline in rationality is accompanied by diminution or absence of feeling. That's, again, very stark. So all this is wonderful. Now, the neat thing, the big contribution that Damasio and his team have made is that they've made this testable. So, and the way in which this happens is Damasio's proposed the somatic marker hypothesis. This is the seminal paper in the field, which has close to 2,700 citations. And there was a follow-up paper with Antoine Beccara, and that also has over 1,600 citations. So the paper focuses on people who have prefrontal cortex damage and amygdala damage. And amygdala is what helps us feel the primal emotions of fear. And by the way, all of this is framed around negative emotions. So what does the hypothesis say? It says that when you face a prospect, our body produces a gut reaction. And this reaction is in response to an image that comes up in our mind of a very bad outcome. So this is all framed quite negatively. So the word soma is Greek for body, and the word somatic is used because all of this is happening in the theater of our body. And marker is because this reaction is marking an image that's come up in response to the prospect that you have seen. So this arises before you make a decision. So the good news is you can still do a decision analysis and not act on it. This is just the gut reaction that's coming up and guiding you. What this is really doing is it's a signal that drastically reduces your options. So for instance, if my goal is get rich quick, then an alternative is go rob the bank next door. There's like a sickening feeling in my stomach, like, no, that's not a real option. So I don't even need to do a decision analysis. That option is off the table. That's the kind of stuff this is referring to, that ridiculous options. You take the sample space of infinite options and take all the stuff that just doesn't feel right, and you come down to the feasible set. And that's where our body really helps us. In short, somatic markers are a special instance of feelings generated from secondary emotions. Those emotions and feelings have been connected by learning to predicted future outcomes of certain scenarios. So secondary emotions, because the event actually hasn't happened. This is a prospect connected to the future, and our brains are wired to do these what-if analyses through our body. So it's really interesting. So now how do you test this? Turns out it is testable. Because the marker is happening in the body and it's connecting to the autonomic nervous system, whenever there are changes in that system, our body, the perspiration in our body changes just a little bit. So you can actually use skin conductance devices, electrical skin conductance, to measure how much did it change, and did it change at all. And these are not perceivable by our minds, but so I'm actually hooked up to one of these, which is checking how my skin conductance is changing during this talk. So this is remarkable because you don't have to go into the scanner. And then they went one step further, and they created a wonderful experiment called the Iowa gambling task. So the slides will be available. There's a link there. I'll kind of be giving you the punchline, but you can try it with other people. So what they did was they give people 4 decks of cards, and 2 piles are seeded with high gain and large future loss. And the other 2 piles have low gain and small future loss. So the idea is that if you play this over a period of time, you will learn that decks A and B are bad for you, because even though you're getting short-term gain, when the ding comes, it's really, really bad. So the strategic ability of us humans is, over time we learn not to pick from that deck. And even though C and D are not great in terms of short-term gains, but over time they accumulate, and you're much better off with that. And so the test was, how do normal people play this game, and how do people with brain damage play this game? So normals learn to switch to the safer decks over time. This was no problem. And they actually saw how literally the skin conductance was driving this. So initially people picked from all 4 decks, and you could see from the graphs that over time, the threshold at which their negative feelings were firing was lowering, and after a point, they just said, okay, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm switching. And those points are very clearly visible. But the ventromedial prefrontal cortex patients did not switch throughout the game. They always chose myopically. So there's like a new kind of bias there, a bias for myopia, because their emotions were not working. And both these patients, both the ventromedial patients and the normals, they registered skin conductance responses, which is interesting. They were getting the emotional hits when they lost, when they got a big ding. The only difference was the ventromedial patients could not learn from it, and normals could. And the amygdala patients were even more severe. They did not even register the skin conductance response. So there was nothing to even learn from. So this is pretty foundational. What it's telling us is, if you have learned anything in your life, it's because you could feel your emotions, and your circuitry is intact to allow you to learn from your emotions. In fact, I worry sometimes from our field that we ignore our emotions to the point where we might be inflicting brain damage on ourselves. I worry sometimes about that, that we lose the ability to discriminate and make our own choices because we are constantly ignoring emotions. So that's just a concern that comes up for me. So the bottom line is that emotions are the apparatus for learning. And Damasio says that all of this research points to 2 possibilities. One is that the cognitive estimate that we make, it automatically connects with our somatic state. So when we're trying to predict the future, somehow it seems to be biologically connected. Or the other option is that a covert, non-conscious estimate precedes any cognitive process on the topic. And my feeling is probably more this one than the other one, that there's something there that happens before our rational apparatus kicks in. And it actually is a part of our rational apparatus, is what I'm learning from this. So when I go back to the questions I started with, the third one, I don't need these MRI machines. I can use these cheap $100 devices to run some experiments of my own. So that was a big thing. That was great. I mean, I don't need a permission of a neuroscientist. Okay. And this connection that I've been experiencing, I can try to see what is happening through skin conductance responses. So that was a really cool thing. So I got myself these Mindfield eSense sensors. This is a German company. It has an app, free app, and you can monitor. I did one session with Ias last night, so he can tell you more about it. We mapped him and also looked at his biological markers. And I have a framework for doing these mappings that has evolved over the years. I just want to mention that it's not important, the specific words that I'm using. What's important is the deep listening. So you may find that through deep listening, you come up with your own framework. It's the deep listening that's important, not the specific framework. So I encourage you to just make your own. Mine is, I found it useful to think in terms of where is the person's emotional energy, their juice, their unstoppable energy, something they can't change about themselves, that's a superpower and a curse at the same time, and their intellectual energy, which is this is the most important one, which is their field of work where they show up, where they get to live out their heart's meaningful purpose and use their superpower as an asset and not a liability. So I'll give you an example. So this was an interesting person, I'll call him Mark. He had just graduated with a degree in mathematics, and he had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. So I started the conversation with, let's do this value mapping. So we wired him up, and there you see the orange and the blue. The orange was him, and the blue was me. And so the conversation began, and the way this works is I take copious notes, and I put timestamps of what I'm feeling. And those timestamps, especially if I'm feeling something really deep in my physical sensations, I'll note the time so I can correlate with the actual readings. So we started with him saying, oh, I'm not very attached. I'm slowly learning I'm actually driven by emotions. Then I asked him, what moves you? And he said, that's a tough one. And he says he was very moved by people feeling powerless around him because of some family circumstances. He had seen family members being utterly powerless, and that just broke his heart. And somehow that spilled into this idea of agency and humanity, that human beings who feel they're powerless, it crushes this young man's heart. And he talked about the economic powerlessness that people are feeling because this is driving the opioid epidemic. And that just, he got very emotional at that point, and I noted that. And you can see that there's a peak right there. And I was listening deeply to his feelings, and you can see that I was feeling it too. So my readings started going up. And see, I noted a peak at 1243, and there it was. And then he says it's incredibly satisfying if you can empower the powerless. Then my brain switched to, okay, I'm a facilitator of the meeting. Now I want to go to the habit. So now I'm not listening to his feelings anymore. And you can see my readings dipped, the blue ones, from 1246. And his habit was basically a poet. The reason he got into math is because he felt math is the poetry of nature. And then we explored for a while career paths. And the two we looked at were public policy and entrepreneurship, and we kicked out public policy. It wasn't empowering enough at the end. And so we settled on entrepreneurship. It's a different kind of entrepreneurship. This is the kind of guy who will go to Liberia and serve and help get markets to Liberia. And he was actually considering that. So then I show him his final mapping and tell him, what do you think? And he just goes silent. That great truth has great silence. That was the methodology. And then he just almost cried. And he said, I feel like I've been understood for the first time in my life. And I noticed the big moment, and I'm feeling it. And you can see that his orange at the very end is kicking up, and mine just shoots up because now I've switched off my facilitator mind. I just want to feel with him, and I'm feeling something too. So this is remarkable. I mean, this is just, it shows that I'm not just cooking this whole thing up. So that was his, the three traits that I noticed in this and shared with him. That was his mapping. Empowering the powerless was his emotional energy. Poetry is unstoppable energy. He'd been writing poems since he was a kid, and he stopped because his parents would show off and show it to everybody else. So as a rebellion, he said, I will not write poems anymore. So, which is very unfortunate. Like if his parents only knew, this guy's a poet, and his intellectual energy was entrepreneurship. So I want to give some caveats here. This was a personal experiment. To be reliable science, it has to be repeated many times. And it's a great research topic. Too bad I've finished my PhD and I can't go back for, well, I don't know. Okay, but maybe somebody else can. So, and then these devices, because they're $100 devices, there are all kinds of issues. Like, sometimes weird things happen. It's hard to get this kind of a consistent result, so I'll just say that. So when I go back now to the last part, which is what are the implications for decision analysis when you take this kind of an approach? And so let's go back to that implicit bottom line we started with. Notice the good decision is one where you feel balance and achieve equanimity. So even decision analysis relies on feelings. You know you've made a good decision because you feel it. Where is that coming from? It's coming from your body. And this is a remarkable myth that's been busted, that everything is happening in the brain. No, we have 10 million neurons in our gut. That's like a satellite brain. We have 40,000 neurons in our heart that's doing all kinds of signaling. And this is one of the most understudied subjects. We're just scratching the surface right now. I wouldn't be surprised if our whole body is like a full brain. So the last part, don't trust your emotions when making decisions, they'll misguide you. I would say, based on all of this, not so fast. It's a more complex story. We can't just wish away our emotions and feelings. That would be sad. So I go back to the purpose of decision analysis, and this is something which David and I have worked on quite a lot. It is that our feelings can also guide us. And decision analysis, what if the purpose is to take complexity off the table so you can focus on who you want to be? What if it only becomes possible to decide when we can feel, and it's hard to feel because the decision is really complex. And what DA does is it makes it simpler. It wrangles the complexity, so now you can reconnect with your gut. So it's like the clouded gut syndrome. You're just getting rid of the cloud so you know this is the way I need to go. And DA is what helps you do that. So it's a very different way of practicing DA. And again, this was completely by accident. It took me years to figure out what was happening. So I go back to the work with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the question there was which countries to enter for conservation work using forest carbon credits. So when they posed this question, my answer was, well, the question, who do you want to be? And their answer was, we're not sure. So we said, okay, no problem. DA to the rescue. So I mapped everybody, their values, and it was quite a spectrum. Some people cared about forest, some people cared about biodiversity, some people didn't care about any of that, they cared about climate change, some people cared about forest dwellers. So we looked at all of that and we said, okay, don't decide just yet because our gut is clouded. We're going to model all these different positions and hold space for our values. We're not going to decide which one it is. So on the top, you see a color-coded a legend there. So there are different value functions here. One is saying a linear valuation on forest cover. Another is saying exponential valuation, which is more forest cover is much better than less forest cover. The third one is saying it's about a trade-off between biodiversity and forest cover. Fourth one is saying, no, it's not just the number of species we're counting, it's the species density. And the fifth one is saying, you're out of your mind counting species. Who are we to assign values? All species are equally important. Okay, so we modeled, and all ecosystems are equally important. That's the fifth one. So we did this, and we worked out the decisions. There's lots of uncertainty modeling simulation in it. And all these different people have different beliefs, different probabilities. So they have different orders of countries they should enter. So when we showed these results, then it became clear, oh, you know what? Out of these 5 positions, one of them is this foundation. The others, they even identified that foundation over there, that's their value position. This one's ours. And it took the decision analysis for them to get clear on who they wanted to be. Now, one view of the world is, we just cheated. You're not supposed to change your numbers to make the decision come out the way you want. But and from another perspective, when you don't know who you want to be, this is a completely legitimate use of decision analysis to figure out who that person is that you want to be. So the result is a clarity on value position that fits us. And this was repeated at the Nature Conservancy, and David was very deeply involved with that work. You can ask him. Some amazing results happened there. The game changer was, when we when we went in with DA, they were like, oh, we don't want to be led by numbers. And we said, no, we are not, the numbers are not going to make decisions here, you are. And this analysis simply takes complexity off the table so you can focus on who you want to be. So if you don't agree with the numbers, you know what, make your own portfolio recommendations, and that's fine. You can choose some options that the numbers say are not a good idea. The important thing is you're going in with truth. Your eyes are open. You're going in for the right reasons, and your reason might be the numbers are not everything, and that's completely fine. And that allowed them to really accept the approach and make it their own. And so the idea is you can still follow the path you want. And the results, one project manager even said that I want to kill my own project because it's not contributing value. And this is happening without upper management saying, axe the projects. So that personal ownership happened. And they all appreciated this because it all started with their value mapping. We started with TNC's intrinsic values and built metrics out of that. So this is not just for nonprofits. We had a lot of experiences with for-profits, and this became a very big hallmark of SmartOrg's approach. At the present company I'm in, at Ulu Ventures, we use decision analysis basically because that's the only way we can respect our entrepreneurs. So when entrepreneurs come, it's one of the most deflating experiences of their lives when they meet a VC, and the VC just judges them and gives no feedback as to why they're saying yes or no. And when we engage with decision analysis, it becomes a collaboration. We do a full market model with them, and at the end of it, we give them a valuation and we tell them, if you think it should be higher, tell us which assumption you should change. And it becomes a very respectful conversation. And sometimes they don't like the valuation, but they can't do anything about it because the assumptions are correct. And sometimes we change the assumptions because we missed something. And so it allows us to be that respectful VC that we want to be. So it's a very different way. And then even decision quality looks different. So when we went back to the original decision quality framework, which is so awesome, felt, well, if you look at it from the point of view of the heart or point of view of our emotions and feelings, then you would not just ask in the frame side, what are your useful perspectives, but also what are the meaningful inquiries you want to undertake. You would not just ask what are the distinct directions you want to take up, but what are interesting possibilities. So we've deepened another layer of questions onto the framework. Information, not just are your sources credible, but also are your forecasts compelling. Value, not just that your metrics are clear, but that you have a noble purpose driving this. Integration, because we changed this piece, which was logic, to integration. Logic is the head side of it. You want insightful reasoning, but you also want an inspiring narrative that takes the community along. And commitment is not just actionable plans, but also aligned intention. So our whole framework is awesome. It doesn't go away. It just deepens to another dimension when you bring all of this back in. So with that, I would like to end and I'll take your questions. And if someone's feeling brave enough, we can do a quick demo of this deep listening as well. But you'd have to make yourself vulnerable. If there is a brave soul in the audience, I will be able to try. But I can't do it without a volunteer.